Today's video is brought to you by Patreon. Patreon. I never could make it without biting. Ask Mr. Owl. As discussed previously, 1981 saw Nickelodeon introduce a lot more narrative television into their schedule, an area that had been sorely lacking in the previous 2 years. The first two shows they introduced were Canadian Wilderness Adventures, one contemporary, one a period piece, but both pretty safe and wholesome and straightforward. Things Nickelodeon thought parents wanted their kids to watch, not necessarily what kids wanted to watch. To that point, while both Adventures in Rainbow Country and Matt and Jenny were stories with young protagonists, both shows still featured parental figures whom the children dutifully obeyed and sought wisdom from. At this time, Nickelodeon wasn't running on a kids-first ethos, but a we're adults and we know what's best for you one, so this made sense. Under the leadership of Shai Snyder, Nick didn't really seem poised for more adventurous and complex genres like, say, science fiction. They had already gotten rid of the two genre shows from the 1979 starting lineup, namely video comics and nickel flicks, and they certainly weren't down for shows where young people circumvented authority, abandoned their parents, and instilled distrust in the government. At least, you would think so. And then the Tomorrow People came along, and I just don't know anymore.
Stephen, look at me. Look carefully into my eyes. Now, do you trust me?
Yes.
Good. Now, I want you to do something. Just try and relax. And imagine that your mind is a fist. A great big fist, clenched tight. Now, let it open. Slowly. No, don't let any other thoughts come into your head. Just think of the fist opening very slowly, like a flower.
I can feel you, right here inside my head. What's happening?
You're becoming one of us.
Who's us?
The Tomorrow People.
The Tomorrow People was a 68-episode British children's science fiction program that originally aired between 1973 and 1979. Like a lot of British science fiction television of that time period, the show ran on a serial format, with one story taking between 2 to 5 episodes to play out, with cliffhangers separating each part. So those 68 episodes are actually only 22 stories in total. The titular Tomorrow People are a small group of young adults, between the ages of 10 and 20, who have unlocked certain telekinetic and telepathic abilities as the next stage of human evolution. This primarily gives them the powers to communicate with thought and to teleport from place to place, or jaunting.
Bye!
Hiding out in an abandoned stretch of the London Underground, the Tomorrow People are assisted on their mission by Tim, a biomechanical supercomputer who monitors all of Earth's activities. Their mission? To find other Tomorrow People when their powers emerge, or break out as they call it. They have to keep all of this under wraps. If the world governments learned about the Tomorrow People, who knows what might happen? Would they be hunted down? Would they be forced to become agents of war?
Hey! You! What do you think you're doing? Come down here this minute!
Jump me in, Tim, jump me in.
All right, Tim.
Acknowledge.
Did you hear what I said?
Anything you say, officer.
No! No! Hang on!
Hey, that's it! You nearly sent me flying.
Sorry, Carol.
At least that's what the show pretends to be about. The whole on the run from the government thing only plays out a few times with little consequence. The real meat of the show included outside forces coming to Earth and the Tomorrow People being forced to deal with them. Alien invaders, meddling time travelers, shape-shifting robots, all the while a galactic federation of telepathic races, all of which look human, they don't even get these Star Trek-style forehead bumps, watch silently from the sidelines, deciding if it's time to bring Earth onto the galactic stage. The British science fiction television serial had already had a long and storied history before the Tomorrow People came around, dating at least as far back as 1951 with Stranger from Space, though the real breakout success was 1953's The Quatermass Experiment, a story of an astronaut returning from a space mission corrupted by an alien presence, which really solidified the formula. These shows never had the budgets for even half-decent special effects, and television cameras of the time couldn't really do long shots, so science fiction of that era tended to be more about intimate close-ups, showing off all the acting in sparse sets and maybe sometimes a monster run down a corridor. In 1963, 10 years after Quatermass, we finally got the main event, the one you've all been waiting for, Doctor Who. We don't need to get into the details of such a popular mainstream show, but it did become the gold standard for British science fiction television serials, and everything that came after was in some way a response to it. Doctor Who aired on the BBC, which, if you're not familiar with British television, is public service broadcasting, meaning it's government owned and funded. That's not quite the blank check you might expect, but it did give the show certain advantages that allowed it to look better than any other science fiction program of that time. The other kind of television stations Britain has is commercial television, and the leader in that is ITV, or independent television. Good old Channel 3 on the knob. Commercial television was introduced after the Television Act 1954, a British law designed to make sure BBC didn't maintain a television monopoly. So even down to its DNA, ITV was designed as a response to BBC. And come the 1970s, the peak of Doctor Who's popularity, ITV was in need of a British science fiction television serial of their own to compete. So ITV's main television producer, Thames Television, went on the hunt for a creative talent that would provide Doctor Who quality ideas to their commercial television station. And who should come knocking on their door with a pitch but this guy, Roger Damon Price.
Taking it in most basic in executive language, Doctor Who was an old man, so we should do ours with young kids.
Price didn't have an extensive resume at this point, but most of the experience he did have was in children's television, and ITV was looking to aim towards a child audience. At one point in the process of developing the show, a representative from ABC approached with the idea of making the show as a joint UK-US venture, but ITV wasn't hearing any of it. An American version of the Tomorrow People? Utter poppycock. When discussing the Tomorrow People, there are usually two main influences cited. The first is Chris Evans. No, not that one. Dr. Christopher Evans, a psychologist/computer scientist/science fiction author who was very interested in the rapid development and implementation of computer technology, and how computer technology mirrored the workings of the human mind. Roger Price crossed paths with Evans while working on a documentary series, and was pretty taken in by Evans' knowledge and enthusiasm, so that when the Tomorrow People project came along, Price got Evans on board as the show's scientific advisor. Evans is credited for the entire show, but by most accounts he was only really meaningfully involved during the first two series. Most of Evans' contributions came in developing the nature of Tim, the artificial intelligence aligned with the Tomorrow People. For example, one subject that fascinated Evans was the functional purpose of dreams, and with their growing complexity, how computers might approach their own version of dreaming.
Now, with computers today, we find that we have regular periods, probably they might be once a week or once a fortnight, when the programs, that's to say the instructions which the computer has, have to be revised and modified and sort of brought up to date to allow the computer to tackle the problems that it's got to tackle. Now, computers aren't as complicated as brains by any means. They're nowhere near as complicated, but they will become as complicated someday, no doubt, and then, of course, I think they'll have to do a lot more of this, what we call program clearance. Now, I think it's very probable that what happens when we go to sleep is that we then run into an automatic revision and reclassification of programs. And this is really what dreaming is.
Tim, have you any ideas on this one?
I'm afraid not. I don't dream. At least I do dream in a way, in that I occasionally have to switch parts of myself offline to relocate information in a random way. And that is a bit like dreaming. But I don't dream in the same way that you do.
No, of course you don't. But the answer does seem to lie in dreams.
The other cited influence might be a bit overblown by legend, but it did happen, and no profile of this show seems complete without it, and that's David Bowie. In 1972, Price had been working on a talk show called Lift Off with Aisha that had Bowie on as a guest, and the two got talking about science fiction in the green room. The myth goes that Bowie was impressed by Roger's ideas for the Tomorrow People and folded them into his own music, namely the use of the term homo-superior, the name of this newly evolved species of human.
As you know, Homo sapiens, that is, ordinary man, evolved over many thousands of years from being primitive ape-like creatures until he became man as we know him.
Like you and me?
Well, no, not like you and me. We're different. We're homo-superior, but we don't like to call ourselves that, so we call ourselves the Tomorrow People.
The conversation may have influenced Bowie, who later went on to sing a homage to the homo-superior.
Oh, you pretty things, don't you know you're driving your mommies and papas insane? Let me say it again, you gotta make way for the homo-superior.
Yeah. Like the idea of BET starting on Nickelodeon, this is an oft-cited myth, and it's not really true. It's actually the other way around. That song, Oh You Pretty Things, came from Bowie's 1971 album Hunky Dory, 2 whole years before the Tomorrow People, and a year before that green room chat. Besides, neither Price nor Bowie came up with the phrase homo-superior. It had already been a pretty common term in science fiction. The earliest known use came from Olaf Stapledon's 1935 novel Odd John, a story between jest and earnest, about a man with superhuman intelligence and psionic abilities. Philip K. Dick used the term in The Golden Man in 1954, where the remnants of a post-apocalyptic Earth hunt down human mutations. And, of course, Homo Superior is the Latin name given to the mutants in Marvel Comics' X-Men. We'll get back to that term, but for now, Roger Price had a fun computer scientist on staff and a couple of glam rock ideas in his back pocket. It's time to put these ingredients together and make us a TV show. So let's meet our characters. We have John, played by Nicholas Young, the leader of the group, a bit of a school prefect type. There was Stephen, played by Peter Vaughan-Clarke, a kid who only just recently broke out and is learning the ropes of being a tomorrow person. There's Carol, played by Sammy Windmill, she's the girl, and Kenny, played by Stephen Salmon. And he is, well, he's Kenny. Yeah, right out the gate, the Tomorrow People had a major problem with characterization. It started with a strong enough hook. The first story, Slaves of Jedikiah, involves Stephen's superpower puberty, giving us a point of view character to introduce everything. All of the sci-fi concepts and the superpowers, and Tim, who's voiced by Philip Gilbert. But half the cast isn't left with much to do beyond this point. Carol is made a captured damsel at one point, yippee, and Kenny... I don't think Kenny ever contributes to the plot, like, ever. He's designated to keep watch over the home base while we go off and have actual adventures stuff.
John, what's going on?
We're in trouble, Kenny. Stand by to take on our position.
We know your position, John. I have an exact fix on your coordinates, ready to jaunt you back at a moment's notice.
No, Tim, there are other saps trapped down here as well as Gin. We've got to try and save them.
Let me jump down and help.
No, Kenny, I've got no time to argue. Talk to him, Tim.
Tim, jump me down.
No, Kenny. I must insist you stay here with me.
Let's go back to the obvious point of comparison, the X-Men, which premiered a whole 10 years before the Tomorrow People. Now, I wouldn't say the original incarnation of the X-Men had deep characters, but you know what made up for that in some way? They all had different powers. This guy shoots laser beams out of his eyes. He has giant wings and can fly. That guy got weird grabby feet, and she can move things with her mind, and he can create ice out of thin air. The varieties of power allow each member of the crew to contribute in some way to the conflict of the week. Now imagine if all the X-Men had Jean Grey's power set. No variety, they all had the same level of telekinesis. Yeah, there's hardly any point in having all these guys now. It's not taking anything away from Jean Grey, but it's also the least flashy of the 5 powers. You'd struggle to give most of the characters things to do whenever Magneto rolls around. The Tomorrow People suffered from this exact problem. I realized they were limited by their television budget to things they could have done with editing or basic practical effects, but if you have a weakness in one department, you really should make up for it in another department, namely, write stronger characters. You'd think they might at least split up the powers, Only one kid has teleportation. Only one kid has telekinesis. You get the idea. Speaking of that budget, yeah, the special effects of the show are basically garbage. And I don't mean by modern standards. These special effects were garbage for 1973.
My main criticism from day one was the lack of care taken over special effects, and I think that let the program down then. It's easy to watch it now, 25 years later, and say, but they didn't know how to do it in those days. That's not true. If a bit more care had been taken over and a little bit more money, the special effects could have been much more effective.
The show implemented a lot of early chroma key back when you couldn't really erase the edges cleanly. And you know, that's okay if it's for a scene where characters float through a Technicolor dimension, but the show used this effect in times where it was completely unnecessary. Like, this is just a shot of two people talking in a ticket booth. They had an actual ticket booth. We see the real thing in other shots, but for this one scene, we had to make it look like trash for no apparent reason. But it's not just the special effects, the entire production feels amateur night. The editing is off kilter, scenes are too short and cut too suddenly. The sound mix is bad. There are scenes where you can't make out dialogue at all.
You all right, darling? Allow me. You see, I don't want to sound as though I'm boasting or anything, but you happen to be in the presence of one of the world's leading experts on the rifle range.
These technical issues did get smoothed out a bit as the series went on, but it does show a creative team not really ready to run a television show. To help remedy this, the Tomorrow People began a tradition of unceremoniously dumping members of the cast between series. Both Carol and Kenny were out between series 1 and 2. Kenny was dropped by the production, presumably because Stephen Salmon wasn't a great actor, while Sammy Windmill left the show because she felt the character of Carol lacked real agency in the story. Instead of feeling the character deepening, I actually felt like I was becoming more shallow of a person. I always seemed to be saying, "John, look out!" and I didn't want to be typecast. After this, the show made what was probably the right decision by replacing these two lead characters with one better written character. Elizabeth, played by Elizabeth Adair, stands out by being an adult Tomorrow person. A young adult, barely 20, sure, but the oldest of the characters by far, and a teacher at that. This allowed a certain level of wisdom over the other characters, including John. But even here, the show struggles to find things for her to do, and have to write reasons for her lack of involvement. Unfortunately, sometimes those reasons are her race. In the third series story, Worlds Away, the Tomorrow People are tasked by the Galactic Federation to travel to a faraway planet and attempt to liberate it from a hostile alien force. As I mentioned before, most of the quote-unquote aliens we see in the show are just people, which makes it very easy to infiltrate these worlds. Or so it would seem.
I think I ought to come with you and Stephen stay here.
Hey.
John and I are the only two who have seen the inside of a Cortan pyramid and know how to find the secret passage.
You know that? And we do stand a chance. Forgive me, but are you from the same planet as these others?
Oh, yes, why?
Then there is an interesting variety of skin color amongst your species. But I am afraid there is no one on Peary with your pigmentation.
He means you can't go because you're black.
I know what he means.
Were anyone to catch sight of your face, it could jeopardize the whole mission.
Well, that's understandable. Just have to stay here and look after the sick and the wounded.
Holy crap! Can you imagine Roger Price sitting in front of his typewriter and typing, "And so the capable young woman couldn't go on the adventure because she was black." Who writes something like this and goes, "Yep, nothing wrong here"? Ah, geez, and they also sidelined Kenny, the other black kid. At least later on they got rid of Elizabeth's awful wig. On the "some people still don't think this is racist" side of things, Series 3 introduced Tyso, played by Dean Lawrence, a Romani child. Only they don't say Romani.
Where is Tyso, Mrs. Boswell? What have you done with your son?
If you don't go now, I'll put a curse on you. A gypsy curse.
So, you believe in magic, do you, Mrs. Boswell?
Of course I do. I'm a gypsy, aren't I? Gypsies can make magic happen.
Yikes. That said, the show was slowly coming together with time. Production values were trickling up. The cast was rounding out better. It was improving. Now, there were some questions if the show was going to be canceled after Series 3, so that series ended up by tying up all the loose ends and having one final showdown with the nearest thing the show had to a main villain, the shape-shifting robot Jedikiah. It was a proper conclusion to half a dozen story arcs, and while the door was still open for further adventures, if the show was to be canceled, it would have a satisfying conclusion. That's actually really good practice for any television show. See all the Buffy the Vampire Slayer season finales, or the series finale for The Secret World of Alex Mack. But the show did come back. So how would it evolve past this point? What would be done to make the Tomorrow People feel fresh? Well, they got a Poochie.
Look, Squidgy, it's our new friend, Poochie. What's that name again? I forgot.
The name's Poochie D, and I rock the telly. I'm half Joe Camel and a third Bonzarelli. I'm the Kung Fu hippie from Gangster City. I'm a rapping surfer, you the fool I pity.
Oh, Poochie is one outrageous dude. He's totally in my face.
Wiggity, wiggity, word up. Rock on, party.
The Tomorrow People wasn't the only project Roger Price was working on. He was also developing a series of children's comedy shows. We'll talk about those shows next time, but the important thing to take away from here is that Roger Price was working with a young teen pop band called Flintlock. Now, Flintlock got pretty popular for a quick second, especially the band's drummer, Mike Holloway. And Roger went, hey, what if we made that cool teen heartthrob a Tomorrow person? They didn't even change his name. His character is Mike, and he plays drums in a band. And the band is played by the other members of Flintlock. Like, imagine it's the third season of Marvel's Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D., and they bring in a new agent, and it's Harry Styles. And his character name is Agent Harry Styles, and now he's the main character. And also the rest of One Direction is there too, hanging out in the background, and they perform songs every once in a while. And also they kick out Fitz and Simmons to make room for him. Yeah, the Tomorrow People did that too. Once they knew Mike was sticking around, they unceremoniously dropped both Steven and Tyso between series 4 and 5.
I got dropped like a brick. I was going to say something else. I got dropped. I mean, you know when you've been dropped is when you make a phone call and they say, sorry, we can't talk to you. Ah. Hello, Nick? No, right. Roger? Anyone? So, yeah, I knew very well I was booted out. But we sort of, I think it ended between agents and management of mine quite nasty.
Yes, it had to happen because you can't have two people so similar. And because I was a musician as well as an actor, it was befitting of the roles that were coming along, hence previous discussion with you, Richard, about the Hearts of Soggoth, because obviously I played all the guitar and the drums and the percussion on those particular things, and therefore that ability was used in the Tomorrow People.
We don't need you anymore, Peter Vaughan-Clarke. We found an even cuter brown-haired boy, and he's in a band, and he wears shark-tooth necklaces, and he's in a band. I don't want to diss on Mike Holloway too much. He wasn't the worst actor the show had, but his introduction was such a transparent attempt to make the show hip with kids while disregarding the hard-working children actors who helped make your show popular to begin with. A few more characters were introduced over the years. Sue Tai, played by Misako Koba, Andrew Forbes, played by Nigel Rhodes. Elizabeth left, but then she came back, but really, the Tomorrow People had become the Mike Holloway show. Let's see, what else? Oh, here's some fun trivia. The Tomorrow People marks the first televised appearance of future Dr. Peter Davison. Let's see what he was up to.
Good meat. Hey, what are you up to then? Good. It's fresh. All my fruit's fresh. We only stock the best here. Up before dawn I am, to see that my customers get the best. And tasty too.
This is a Series 3 story called A Man for Emily, which, I mean, what even is this?
Okay, man boy, fetch his food. If
If you think I'm gonna run around after you and wait on you, you've got another thing coming.
Oh, the mama, he's being real bad now. Can I now the mama hug him?
Sure, Emily. I reckon it's time he learned his place.
Okay, man boy. I'm gonna show you who's boss.
What do you mean?
It's no secret that science fiction wasn't Roger Price's genre of choice. He was much more interested in comedy and tried to cram in as much comedy into the show as he could. A Man for Emily is the peak of this awfulness, where Peter Davison is an alien running around dressed like a cowboy killing people. And also the Tomorrow People can just resurrect people now? They can just do that? Why can they do that? Even Price admits that the episode was too much. Everyone knew that the inclusion of comedy was having a detrimental effect on the Tomorrow People, but in those days, the way TV companies worked meant that I had a lot of creative freedom. People thought, if Roger wants to put comedy into his show, then that's his business. No one would interfere. Perhaps they should have? And I think this brings us back around to the idea of homo-superior, the driving idea behind the show's science fiction. It's a complicated idea. In David Bowie's song, the phrase wasn't used as a separation of human species, but as a signifier of future young generations rolling in to take the place of older generations. And the primal power fantasy within the Tomorrow People is the same thing. This show is aimed for that demographic of young people who are starting to feel the weight of authority. My parents don't understand me, my teacher doesn't understand me, and the government sucks. If only I had the power to rule myself. The Tomorrow People is completely devoid of parents and teachers. Most adults shown are over the top and buffoonish, especially police officers. And believe me, I am all for dressing down authority. Price has described himself as a left-wing anarchist, which would normally excite me. But the show isn't as anti-authoritarian as you might think. Sure, the Tomorrow People try to circumvent the governments of Earth, but they are completely under the employ of the Galactic Federation. Some of them even become agents for them. They basically become space cops, which I guess are totally different from normal cops. The show's not anti-authority, it's just anti-this specific Earth authority. Shove off, Earth Prime Minister, I've got a new Prime Minister from space. And he wears a fun glittery space cloak, and he lets me shoot ray guns, and he's in a band. Really, the main theme of the Tomorrow People, however intentional or unintentional it might be, is presumed superiority. The Galactic Federation is just presumed better than the authorities of Earth, and likewise, the homo-superior is presumed better than the homo sapiens that came before. And you realize what that sounds like, right? One race of people presumed superior over another? The Tomorrow People are so sure of their own racial superiority that they'll allow for global extinction, then allow for their species to be compromised by world governments.
There is one definite correlation, John.
What's that, Tim?
The readings show a massive movement of the continental plates.
How massive is massive?
About 25 centimeters in the last 4 days.
Was that bad?
Taken in conjunction with the rest of the stuff we've been recording, it is.
Well, shouldn't we warn them? The saps, I mean. For all we know, they may be responsible without knowing it.
How do you mean?
Well, underground nuclear tests and that sort of thing.
You really think they'd believe us, Carol?
Well, I don't know. But if it's serious enough, we should warn them. It is their planet as well as ours.
You could have fooled me the way they abuse it.
Carol, you know as well as I do, they wouldn't take a blind bit of notice of us. Well, not unless we reveal we're Tomorrow People. Have you any idea what that would mean? Well, suddenly, overnight, we become a national asset, a potential weapon of war. We'd spend the rest of our lives guarded by guns and tanks in case anybody else got their hands on us.
Until we jaunted off somewhere. That's not the point.
But if it did come to the crunch, John?
If it came to the crunch, Carol, it might be kinder not to tell them.
Even if the Earth is in danger of total destruction?
Yes, Carol. Even if it is.
Yeah, just because you have superpowers doesn't mean you're a superhero. The Tomorrow People are what the ignorant humans in the X-Men comics assume the X-Men are, believing themselves superior to the common people. The show tries to justify this with the idea that humans are selfish and destructive, but there's only really one story that even directly addresses what you would assume to be the central conflict of the entire series. Secret Weapon, the first story of Series 3, has the Tomorrow People tracked down by a weapons research establishment to be made into weapons of war. And actually, it's the best story of the entire show, as it directly addresses the show's core concepts, and it isn't a man for Emily. There's not a lot of comedy in this one. Oddly enough, the show seems to go out of its way to redeem the human race for its various atrocities. There's a lot of ancient aliens, chariots of the god type stuff here about aliens coming down to ancient times and building the pyramids and establishing all the civilizations and all that. In the Series 2 story, The Blue and the Green, we learn that the Nika riots of 6th century Rome were caused by aliens who give off violent auras or something. And then there's the Hitler story. Hitler is an alien and he's still alive, and he used chemtrails to make everyone in the world secret Nazi sleeper agents. Fascism is a bioengineered disease created by aliens.
Young peoples of the world, your fathers have told you many lies about me, but I stand for glory and honor, for the triumph of youth and might. I have come back to lead you to a great tomorrow. Men can now travel through space. There is a whole universe to conquer, and beyond that, the stars. I will lead you there. I am Adolf Hitler. You will obey me.
Yeah, there was a point in time when storytellers were like, hey, we had the Nazis once, we're never going to have the Nazis again. Why don't we just make the Nazis into fun adventure villains? And now here we are. Fascism and white supremacy is back in a big way, and maybe I don't have the patience for a story where you can defeat fascism by stopping alien Hitler's mind control. Seriously, guys, you can't have a show that says human beings are bad, that's why we must operate in secret, and then take away what many people consider the biggest monster the human race has produced in the last 100 years. You can't say he's an alien with mind control powers and then blame the bad stuff the Nazis did on the human race. You're saying humans are bad one second, and then saying that every bad thing humans have ever done were because of evil aliens. Which is it? Did the Hitler episode air on Nickelodeon? I want to assume the Hitler episode didn't air on Nickelodeon, but it's hard to say. Look, I think it's clear by now that I don't think The Tomorrow People was a very good show. It was cheap, it was poorly written, it was disrespectful to its cast, and it was bad science fiction. But it was popular. It built a small but dedicated fan base, and it's still talked about wherever British science fiction television serials are talked about. Guys, the entire series is on DVD. Do you know how relaxing it is to just have a show be available on DVD with like audio commentaries and special features and stuff, and I don't have to scour the dark web for footage? Oh man, this is the life. But yes, it was a popular and successful show, running for 8 years and ending in 1979. Just a few years later, and Nickelodeon picked up the American broadcast rights to the company D.L. Taftner Limited, an export company who brought a lot of Thames television over to the States, most notably being responsible for the American broadcast of The Benny Hill Show. But why? Why did Cy Schneider choose what was, on paper at least, an anti-authoritarian science fiction show that had no edutainment value? The show employs a great deal of special effects, but not your cornball rocket to the moon and bug-eyed monster stuff. It's a contemporary, realistic series which probes the limits of human intelligence. The Tomorrow People combines two popular trends: a return to the suspense and action of the Saturday matinee serial, and the current vogue for science fiction fantasy. Okay, Schneider may not have actually watched the show if he thinks it doesn't have rockets to the moon and bug-eyed monsters stuff.
What an interesting beast.
Let's work our way round to the portal.
will be double, because there is good reason to believe there are alien intruders on this planet. They must be here to steal our diamonds.
You showed us the error of our ways. We were wrong and you were right. Please accept our apologies.
You mean we're forgiven?
Forgiven? My dear John, it is you who should forgive us.
But as to the question of why have the Tomorrow People on Nickelodeon at this point in the channel's history, well, this is just a theory. But Nickelodeon was taking a lot of its cues from PBS at that time. A lot of their shows mimicked PBS children's television when they weren't just getting the rights to broadcast old PBS shows. The channel even had a lot of PBS alumni on staff. Early 80s Nickelodeon was basically PBS you paid for. And during that time, you know what was airing on PBS? Doctor Who. The first 4 seasons of Tom Baker's run, to be exact. Not the first American broadcast of the show, but the first successful one. And hey, if PBS has Doctor Who, we should get some British science fiction television serials of our own. And hey, isn't this the main competitor to Doctor Who?
Tuesday afternoon on Going Great, it's high fashion. Then Vicky is being held against her will, and only Black Beauty can save her. Next on Against the Odds, 2 radical scientists, Louis Pasteur and Margaret Mead. And can the Tomorrow People complete their mission before the burning? Don't miss the action. Tuesday, starting at 3:30 Eastern, 12:30 Pacific on Nickelodeon.
And despite my misgivings about the show itself, Nickelodeon really needed a show like the Tomorrow People more than ever. We're at a point when Nickelodeon was gaining a reputation as a green vegetable channel, something that was good for kids, but not necessarily something kids liked. A weird science fiction action comedy like the Tomorrow People probably felt like an oasis in a desert of well-meaning but dull educational programming. And while it wasn't the singular most popular thing on the channel, the Tomorrow People became just as strongly associated with Nickelodeon's early years as Pinwheel and the show we'll be talking about next time. So much so that in the 90s, Nickelodeon would bring it back, producing a reboot series in-house. But we'll talk about that show when we get to Knacks 1992. Aside from the reboot, you could feel the echoes of the Tomorrow People in a lot of the science fiction series Nickelodeon produced through the 90s. The Secret World of Alex Mack, The Journey of Alan Strange, Space Cases, and Animorphs all feel like they owe a little something to this funky mess of a show. And then there was Roger Price himself. This was only the first of many times Price would become involved with Nickelodeon. After the Tomorrow People ended, he decided to take his children's comedy idea across the pond, to Canada, where he would develop a show that would have an even greater impact on the channel. But that's a story for next time.
Nick, 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 Nickelodeon. Nick, 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 Nickelodeon.
Next time, it's the big one, kids, the one that changed it all. Grab your umbrellas, because we're about to get slimed. There's a part of me that just wants to throw today's shout out towards the Tomorrow People DVDs. They're easy to find, they have special features, and each episode is basically riffed on by the old cast. They think the show is just as clunky as I do. I won't be seeing a show with this kind of a DVD release again in a long time. But no, if you want something to read, today's shout out goes to British Science Fiction Television, a Hitchhiker's Guide, edited by John R. Cook and Peter Wright. A good primer on them British science fiction television serials, with a sizable section on the Tomorrow People and their place within the genre. Thank you all so much for watching. Stay tuned, the big one's coming up next. You can't do that on television, and I am super excited. If you're excited too, and like what you've been seeing, perhaps consider contributing to my Patreon. I'm trying to make this work as my main thing, my main job, and every dollar is a step towards giving me job security and improving my production values. You can also help out by liking, subscribing, hitting that bell icon, following me on Twitter, and sharing Knickknacks with your friends. Spread the word, and let's make Knickknacks a huge deal.